Welcome to the Birds and the Bees podcast. This is Braxton Dutson.
That's the key. People aren't talking about it.
Everybody needs to know that porn is not a documentary.
It's not like if we don't talk to kids about sex and sexuality, they're not going to hear about it. They're just not going to hear about it from us.
They have tons of questions, they just don't know how to ask them.
All you have to do is be one chapter ahead. You don't have to know everything. Just one chapter ahead of wherever your child is.
Lubrication is lubrication, right? I've tried lube and it gives me UTIs or yeast infections, so I don't use it anymore. Why is there honey in my lube? Friends don't let friends use KY. Dale Mueller is a sex educator at the Smitten Kitten, and they are on the show today to give us up-to-date facts about lubrication, dispel myths, and answer the questions about lube that you never thought to ask. Hey everybody, this is Braxton Dutson. Welcome to Birds and Bees podcast. I'm so glad to be with you hive mates once again. And if this is your first time, welcome to the show. Super excited that you found the podcast. Thank the person that referred you to it because you're in for a treat. If you're a longtime listener, thank you for your continued support and tuning back in. This interview is brought to you by the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit. The 2019 Rocky Mountain Sex Summit will be doing a deep dive into reproductive sexual health by bringing the best and the brightest, literally, from around the world to share content that is leading the conversation on reproductive sexual health. I mean, from our last episode with Laura Bryden, she's coming from New Zealand. So literally from around the world. Some of the topics that will be covered at the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit are all about understanding our reproductive journey, what the impact of contraceptive choices are in our sex life, what the role of ovulation is in the overall health of a female body person, how perimenopause influences sexual health, mental health, emotional health, and relationships as a whole. What are the resources and options we can provide to ourselves, to our clients, and help everyone feel informed and empowered as it relates to menstruation, contraception, and perimenopause? There's a lot more that's going to be covered there, but that is just a sneak peek into what's going to be talked about. Dale Mueller is one of the presenters at the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit this year, and they will be presenting on November 16th. Everything you need to know about lubrication is going to be jam-packed into that presentation. Today's episode is meant to give us a general understanding about lubrication and a little sneak peek into what they're talking about. This event is for everybody, not just clinicians. And I'm really excited to bring this to you because as I saw Dale a couple years ago, totally became a fan, and I've wanted to get this information out to y'all anyway. So the sheer fact that Dale's here is just really exciting for me. So this episode is one that is near and dear to my heart, and I think it's important for everyone to understand it. If you find this episode supportive, I encourage you to think of someone who could use this episode and share it with them. We're all growing together in these discussions, and you sharing this may be the support that they need to start important conversations with their kids, with their partners, especially when it comes to lube and partners. And this information on this podcast could be just what someone needs. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave me a voicemail or text me at 385-449-1818, or you can email me at birdsandbeespodcast@gmail.com. I do have to say on a more personal note that the Late Late Show with James Corden has invited me on to their show on November 18th I wish to talk about sexual health, but it is to chug mustard, which I chugged mustard in efforts to have parents mustered up their courage to talk to their kids about sexual health. So while I'm on there, I'm not just going to be chugging it to be weird. I'm going to be chugging it for all of you, and hopefully even bring more people into the hive so that we can keep mustering up this courage to talk to our kids about sexual health and to have these conversations. So I'm going to be up there keeping the buzz alive and keeping it going for all of you. And I'm excited for anyone that wants to watch. It's going to be November 18th during their main show. But thanks again for listening. I really appreciate all of you, and I love the support that I feel from each and every one of you. Now let's get on to talking to lube with Dale. Thanks so much. Hey, welcome to Birds and Bees podcast. This is Braxton Dutson, and today I have on the show Dale Mueller. I'm so excited to have you on the show because one of the things that I've wanted to do on this podcast is talk about lube, and today we're going to be talking about lube. Welcome to the show, Dale.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you, just like I said, because we are talking about something that, one, I don't think very many people know about, and we're kind of on this... I'm going to say the cutting edge. Like there hasn't been a lot of research, or there's been research, but it's also not been spread out very far. Is that right?
Yeah. I would say that's very correct. I think that a lot of times when I try to get folks interested in lube or do conferences where I'm talking about lube, people come in with like, how are they going to talk about lube for a whole hour? And I'm like, y'all, when I first wrote this presentation, like I put all of the information I had into it. I was so passionate, and I did it for a coworker. And at 2.5 hours, they had to stop me because they were like, you can't just monologue about lube for 3 hours. So there's a lot that people don't know that they don't know about lube. So I'm very excited to talk about it. But yeah, it's one of those things that I think people just sort of trust that the lube out there is going to be for them. And that is not always the case. It's not always like a very well vetted product. And also that if you're not shopping for lube somewhere that knows about lube, you are only seeing a fraction of the lubricants that are really available to you. So I think it's a lot about just like context and knowing what you don't know.
Definitely knowing what you don't know. And I think that's why I've heard you say this before, and I've picked it up, and other people have been saying it, and I completely love it. But don't let friends use KY, and we're going to get into that throughout this entire podcast. But starting out, I guess I'm curious, why are all lubes not necessarily created equal? Why can't we just go grab one off the shelf?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. The main one to me is just really the ingredients. Not all lubes are formulated with genitals in mind. It's not like a malicious thing, but it's like an oversight kind of a thing. Like there's ingredients and properties specifically to water-based lubricants that are just bad for genitals, like bad for mucous membranes or bad for the like healthy microbiota that lives on genitals. And like not all lubes are the same for different uses. So something that might work really well for vaginal use might cause discomfort if used anally. So depending on what you're using the lube for, there's probably a better suited and a lesser suited kind of lube. And then there's just ingredients and formulas that are bad for bodies. And part of that is that our like the FDA certification testing that is done on lubricants doesn't really reflect use on genitals.
Oh, no kidding.
And so that's not a good predictor of actual safety. So that's one reason why not all lubes are created equal. It's just like some of them are less safe. And then the other part of it is people have so many different personal preferences and really different bodies, different things they want to do with their bodies. So there might not be one lube that like serves all of your lube purposes. And there are definitely going to be lubes that people don't like, or don't like how they affect their bodies. So personal preference and just like the level of individuality in a person's sexual preferences and in a person's physical body mean that not all lube is going to work for everybody. That's one thing that when I talk to people, they're like, well, I've used lube and I didn't like it, or it gave me yeast infection. So like lube is kind of terrible, right? And I'm like, no, just like that lube like didn't work for you. There's so many other kinds. And I'm really privileged to have done most of my sex education career at the Smitten Kitten, which is a sex toy store that's really education focused and really focused on body safe, non-toxic sex toys and lubricants.
And is that out of Minnesota, or are there other places?
Yeah, so we're just in Minneapolis, but we do have an online store. But there's other like feminist, education focused sex toy stores all over the country that do similar things. And one of the things that makes shopping for lube easier in our space is, yes, we've vetted the lube that we carry for ingredients, but also we have testers. So you can feel it on your hands. And that's like such a big deal. Because when you're just buying something off the shelf in a Target or online from a retailer that you don't really know a lot about them, like I feel like there's like a 70-30 chance like 70% of the time it's not going to be great, and 30% of the time it'll be good and what you like. But just, it's so hard to predict that part of it.
Definitely. I think as I started learning more about this, and this, especially as we've been talking, or that I went to a presentation that you gave probably 3 years ago here in Salt Lake, and went to a Walmart, went to Target, and went down the condom and lube aisle and started looking, and I was like, I wonder where are all these ingredients? I think at one point in time you said some of them have honey in them. And I'm like, no, that's bull. There's no way that they got honey and they're putting honey in this. And I pulled up one of the I can't remember the sensation ones where it's like his and hers sensation lube. Yeah. And one of them had honey in it, and I was like, "You have got to be kidding me!" I had no idea. There's sugar in that one, which is going to definitely cause, or could potentially cause, yeast infections. And the vast majority, like the 70-30 that you're talking about, I would agree with that probably 70, and even in Walmart, I was looking at maybe 90% of the lubes had. What are some of the more common ones? It was like glucosamine or glucose. Yeah,
so lubricants that have propylene glycol or glycerin are a problem a lot of the time for a couple reasons. That's one thing that complicates lube stuff when there isn't a lot of research to go off of, because there isn't a direct like causation when you're looking at ingredients like glycerin leading to like yeast overgrowth, which is very common anecdotally, because I work in a sex toy store and sell lube to people and talk to people about lube in real life. And even within the larger like sex education community, people are like, yeah, glycerin causes yeast infections. Scientifically, if you set that up in a study, there isn't a causational relationship, but it's definitely correlated. But nobody's funding like research to find out why that correlation is there. But propylene glycol and glycerin are definitely ingredients to avoid. And then for sure, honey, glucose, maltodextrin, even things that are just sugars. You really want to avoid in your lube if you're using it vaginally, because it could lead to yeast overgrowth for sure. But also it just feels bad. It feels tacky. It feels sticky, and it creates more friction once the water in the lube has been absorbed into the skin or evaporates. So then you're just using a bunch more lube, because every time it gets sticky and tacky, you add lube, so it's slippery again. And then when that dries out, it's even stickier and even tackier. Oh. So, yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. So when it gets stickier and tackier, it may feel really slippery at the very beginning, like right as soon as you take it out of the bottle or the package. And then afterwards, it tends to dry up really quick. It's sticky, tacky. It may start pulling on skin or things along those lines.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So we've got, I guess I was wondering about that. Do they put in these sugars, these other, is that to keep it so it stays slippery and lubricated for as long as possible? Do we know why they're putting honey and all these other things in there?
I mean, sometimes it's for flavor. Often it's to make the product taste better or make it like multifunctional. I remember when I was a fresh young sex educator, I tried this product that was like Kama Sutra oil, but it wasn't an oil. It was a water-based product that was supposed to be like edible flavored lubricant you could also use for massage. And it was real gross, to be honest. But it had sugars in it to create a flavor, and was very sticky and very tacky. And then there's other ingredients like glycerin and propylene glycol that they aren't actually sugars proper. So they're not digested by like the body the same way. So they're not going to lead to yeast overgrowth by feeding yeast directly. But they affect other things in the microbiome and on the mucous membrane that can also lead to yeast overgrowth. And those also can feel sticky and tacky. And those are ingredients that are added to keep the water from evaporating as quickly, and to thicken the lubricant. So it might feel like a little bit more of a cushion. It might feel like a little bit more of a glide. And again, it's just going to be for that first like 5 or 10 minutes. And then it's going to feel thicker and weirder and dry out a little bit.
Gotcha. So these different ingredients may have that first initial feel, but then you either need to keep re-adding, or you may feel irritation, but it can do all sorts of things with your body, and you've got to really take an understanding of that.
Yes. Yeah.
Gotcha. So as we're talking about this with the tackiness and the different ingredients and things like that could cause issues, what about KY or Trojan or some of these other ones that are really big brands that tend to have these? Why don't friends let friends use KY?
KY specifically is interesting because KY jelly, like the traditional KY jelly, it says doctor recommended on the packaging. And it has like the most brand recognition. So people just default trust it because it's what they've heard of. And then they see this doctor recommendation thing. And I've also, talked to doctors who had been recommending it. And when I ask why, there's kind of two reasons that I'm given. And I think are bad. But the first one is just that's the lube I know. It's that's what has been doctor recommended previously. I don't know who that first doctor was.
The first doctor said it, and it just keeps going.
It's been around a long time, and so that's kind of that. And then the other thing is because it's similar to Surgilube, and Surgilube is a sterile lubricant that is used in hospitals for a variety of things. Mm-hmm. It's water-based, as is KY jelly, and then it has an ingredient in it that's an antiseptic called chlorhexidine gluconate. And then it is also hyperosmotic, which we'll get into in a second probably. So it's potentially pretty harmful when it comes to using it for moisturizing and for sexual purposes. Even though it totally makes sense to use that for catheterization in a hospital, mm-hmm. That's very different than using it for personal use. An antiseptic can kill healthy bacteria. It can cause stinging. If you already have a compromised mucous membrane at the genitals, it can feel really uncomfortable, and it can dehydrate skin and mucous membranes and create this immune response that can be counterproductive for certain folks with certain chronic illnesses. So that's a big reason to not use KY jelly for sure. And then one thing to also remember about big brands that are making lube like Asterglide, Trojan, KY is they're making a lot of different kinds of lube. And to be totally honest, not all of them are bad. Water-based lube is the trickiest. Water-based lube is where you want to be really careful. And then silicone-based lube is the easiest. Silicone-based lube is from brand to brand, super duper similar. Most of the time, they're all the brands are using 3 to 6 ingredients out of a pool of 10 ingredients. So wow. It's really easy to navigate. Most silicone-based lubes are hypoallergenic. There are, when I started doing research in lube, pretty much silicone lube was silicone lube. Now there's more warming or flavored or fragranced silicone lube. Wow. So I don't really recommend those. So if you're shopping for a silicone-based lube, find one with 6 or less ingredients, preferably 4 or less, and that's all they need. They're fine. They're great. They last forever. Mm-hmm. And then KY does make an oil-based suppository for moisturizing. That's pretty good. It's not the best thing in my opinion, but it's not actively harmful the same way their water-based are. And a similar thing for Asterglide. Their silicone's totally fine. Their water-based is better than it was years ago, but it's still not in my top recommendations. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think friends don't let friends use actively harmful lube. And also I think friends should talk to friends about what lubes are out there. If you know you have a lube you like, and you're this has been great for me, don't be all of my friends should buy this one lube, because I guarantee you it's not going to work for all your friends. Mm-hmm. But say hey, I found this really great company. I like their ethics. I like their ingredients. They make a couple different lubricant formulas. Maybe you want to start there. Mm-hmm. Or, hey, I bought this lube from this shop and they don't sell all the stuff that you find at Target, but their stuff is better. You could go in there or shop there online and probably get a really good lubricant for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. That it's even my statement with friends don't let friends use KY can be way too much of a blanket statement, but we're looking for what is helpful, what is supportive, and it just tends to be mostly the water-based where we're trying to keep it as liquid as possible or something like that.
Yeah. Water-based is the most complicated for sure. An easy recommendation to anybody is like, have you tried a silicone lube? Try that. Because chances are that even if they don't love the texture, it's not going to harm their body.
Gotcha.
So that's positive.
So I'm hearing you name a couple different lubricants. We've got water-based, silicone. Are there other types of lubricant?
Yeah. So water-based is definitely like the biggest category with the most available options. It's also the most affordable and it's compatible with everything. Any kind of safer sex barrier method, like a condom or a dental dam, and any kind of sex toy or tool. And then, silicone-based lubes, which are way more available than they used to be. So you'll definitely find them in like a grocery store or a convenience store, but you kind of have to know what you're looking for because they don't like get their own little section. And those are great. They are not always compatible with solid silicone sex toys. So that's kind of the one drawback for folks there. And then you've got oil-based lubricants. So oil-based lubricants are really great for folks who need a lot of moisturizing and a long-lasting lubricant. They are not compatible with most latex or polyisoprene safer sex barriers. And so there are some safer sex barriers that are compatible with oil-based lube. You just need to be kind of careful. And those are polyurethane or nitrile. And those are harder to find. So you probably have to order them online. And honestly, like if you're a person with a penis, you probably won't like them as much because they're less elastic than the other materials. So it's kind of like you got to talk to your partner and figure out where your priorities are when it comes to safer sex and lube to decide kind of those things. But oil-based lube is also a little bit tricky because you don't want to use anything that's not a plant-based oil inside of the body. So like there's masturbation creams that are designed specifically for like stroking on a penis on the outside of the body. Most of those have petroleum-based oils and are not meant to be used for like lubricants for penetrative sex of any kind because they can really quickly lead to bacterial overgrowth and potentially like bacterial vaginosis. So like one time I did a home party for the Smitten Kitten and was talking about this masturbation cream. And one of the people interrupted to just be like, this explains every yeast infection I've ever had.
Oh, no.
And so it's a safe product if you use it as prescribed, essentially. But it's not safe for everything. So coconut oil, just like the kind of coconut oil you buy at the grocery store, is a very popular lubricant. Coconut oil in particular is great for lube because it's naturally antimicrobial and antifungal. So it doesn't upset the kind of like equilibrium you've got going on of bacteria inside the vagina or inside the anus, which is nice. And definitely over the last like 3 years, there's a lot more commercially available oil-based lubricant formulas that folks can easily find at like sex toy stores, which is really awesome. And they're safe for going inside the body. And those formulas where you're mixing stuff with the oil base tend to either have like beeswax or shea butter or some sort of more like stable ingredients. So as opposed to like scooping some coconut oil and having it like liquefy instantly in the heat of your hand, you have a product that has some different ingredients to balance that out. So the texture and the viscosity stays more similar over different temperature ranges, which just makes it like less of a mess.
Makes it less of a mess. I've heard one person, as you're talking about this, I've heard one person or a couple people say, that instead of, scooping in as you were describing there, because then if we're touching body parts and then scooping and then putting the lid back on, and it was starting to become one of, they were worried about germ spreading and things like that. What they were talking about doing is getting an ice tray cube and then putting, I believe it is, they just froze the coconut oil in there and then they could pop one out and they called them lube cubes.
Yes,
that's cool.
Such a good way to do it. You can even keep them in the fridge in like a Tupperware. So it's not so frozen that it's painful to put on your body. It'll still be solid. And yeah, I work with folks who have, gone through menopause or cancer treatment that will use those as suppositories just for moisturizing. But yeah, that's a really, really smart way to do it. And just in general, important to keep your like food oil separate from your lube oil.
Totally. Agreed.
Yeah, keeping track of like what has this hands going into this jar touched and making sure that's okay. So some people also just like keep a little spoon by their jar of lube oil, and that's fine.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. Definitely. When it comes to, so we're not wanting to use oil based with safer sex barriers. We're not wanting to. We'd be really careful with. I believe you said the silicone based. On silicone based, it's good to test it out if you're going to. But I was also hearing like high level silicone, like medical grade, and high level silicone base can sometimes work together. But rule of thumb being kind of like, make sure if you feel like it's going to be okay, test it first. But it can the silicone can essentially eat away at the silicone. Is that right?
Sort of. Yes, some silicone lubes are compatible with some silicone sex toys, and also sometimes the like combination is doing a thing, but it's like not a big deal to the person who's owning the toys, so they might not care.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because this is one of those like sex ed myths that will not die. Where there's this idea that silicone like melts silicone, that they degrade each other. And that's not actually what's happening. So what can happen is that the lubricants can bond onto the surface of the toy. So as opposed to like degrading it, it's like adding a little layer. And then that layer can just sit there and change the texture. And sometimes what happens is that layer like pills up like fuzz on a sweater, and makes like weird little silicone balls that then come off and then rough up the surface of the toy.
Gotcha.
So it doesn't create anything new. There's no like chemical reaction that would create anything that's harmful. It doesn't, it can't hurt your body in that sense. And any little like pills of silicone from the toy and the lube combining wouldn't be something that you could absorb into your body. So the only real harm that can come from that is like slowly changing the surface texture of your toy, which would maybe make you like using it less or make it have more friction and be irritating. So it's not like as high stakes as I think some folks make.
It's gonna melt in me.
Right. Yeah. Not that at all. That kind of comes from the idea of toys melting. Comes from like jelly and rubber toxic toys melting, because that's a thing that they do on their own, no matter what kind of lube you use on them. Toxic toys with phthalates, rubber toys, jelly toys, those are things that will, if you put them in a jar, they will just melt if let them sit there long enough. So that's something that like was foundational to the Smitten Kitten starting, was that we were the first ever totally non-toxic sex toy retailer.
Wow.
And so that like that idea of like, wow, there's all these toys with toxins in them and they're really bad for your body. Like the stakes for that are actually much higher than the stakes for lube, because those toys have things like carcinogens in the materials. And the materials are unstable. So they're like, you're absorbing chemicals from them into your body. That project, that mission of the Smitten Kitten really like laid the groundwork for me to be able to do a similar thing with lubricant now. So if you see a toy melting, it's not because it's a silicone toy that you put silicone lube on, but it's really important because that means that toy isn't actually silicone. It's a toxic material and you like don't ever want to put it in your body again.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And we were talking about, or you mentioned a little bit earlier about osmolality. It's a little bit of, can you tell us a little bit some of the research, but especially what, as you say osmolality, I think of Osmosis Jones, that cartoon movie back in the day that could kind of in and out of things.
That's actually a really helpful visual. So if you've seen that movie and you understand osmosis, you're like halfway there. So osmolality is something that I discovered as I was looking into lubricant safety because, like I mentioned, the research that's out there around lubricants is challenging and limited. And none of it has been centered in like human genitals and pleasure and health, really, in a way that you would think that would exist. You would hope that would exist. That stuff doesn't super exist. So a lot of the information that I've garnered around lubricants comes from research that is more about preventing the spread of HIV or different STIs through different ideas of putting active ingredients in a lubricant base, and then those ideas failing and the investigation as to why they failed. So that investigation into why they failed is how we figured out kind of this idea of the osmolality of the lubricant really affecting its safety and its how it changes the mucous membrane. So osmolality is like a funny science word that doesn't 100% mean concentration, but is very close. So if you can imagine, the osmolality of the lubricant is kind of the reflection of how much stuff, other ingredients, is in the water base of the lube. So it only applies to water-based lube. And it's just about kind of how much other stuff is in that water base, how concentrated it is. That affects the mucus, like your body's natural lubrication or the mucus on a mucous membrane, as well as the tissue underneath that mucus because of osmosis, because you're working with mucus and mucous membranes that have permeable cell walls.
Yeah.
And then the lubricant ingredients are, largely in a water base. So the osmolality of the lube compared to the osmolality of the mucus and the mucous membranes on your body affect each other because they essentially want to even out.
Gotcha. Looking for that homeostasis.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you're putting a product that has a radically different osmolality than the mucus of your body onto the mucus of your body, it's going to dramatically change that mucus. And that's when you can start seeing irritation, immune response, inflammatory response, cell death, those kinds of things.
Wow. So looking at those 4 things you just described, with cell death, with irritation, inflammation, this might be something that, say, a female body person, whether they're going to a gynecological exam or anybody that's deciding to use or experience anything anally, but working with those mucous membranes, that if you start to feel irritation or you start to notice really any change in the mucus after using a lubricant, that could be that irritation that we're talking about.
Yeah, totally. And I think that this is like one of the reasons that I started looking into Surgilube initially wasn't because I was that far in my research that I understood what was going on. But it was because one of my buddies was a pelvic model for medical students. So because like she was in school as well, so she would have, folks practice doing kind of yearly pelvic exams on her, like as part of their medical school training. And she came to me because she was like, every time I'm a pelvic model, I'm fine. And I'm getting like 5 pelvic exams, in a day. And then I go to the gynecologist and I get 1 pelvic exam and I'm itchy for 2 days. There's weird discharge. And I didn't get a PAP at my last one. I always thought it had been the PAP. And I still had that happen. And the only thing that I can name that's different about those 2 experiences is that one uses lube and one uses water. So they're using lube in the gynecology office. They're using water to lubricate the speculum in the pelvic exam practice. And so that's when I started looking into Surgilube. And I think it's really interesting because it speaks to a larger issue is that a lot of people just assume that like doctors know best, or even that like manufacturers like KY, like Asterlide know best. So if they're having an irritation response, if they're having different discharge, if they're having discomfort afterwards, they're thinking of every reason other than that product causing it. They're thinking, I'm too sensitive. There's something wrong with my body. There's something wrong with my partner's body. And they never think that like maybe this lubricant product is actually just the reason. It's as simple as that. So that's a big thing that comes up a lot, is just reassuring people like, if a lube doesn't work for you, it's not your fault. There is nothing wrong with your body. It's probably that product, and let's find a different product that's going to work better.
Definitely. So being able to check in with what your responses are, and you don't have to just take the response, whether it's at a yearly exam or whatever you're experiencing, you can change things up, and that lube does play a factor into it. Yeah. And then one thing too that I wanted to mention is just that, yes, folks with vaginas generally are a big part of what we're talking about when we're talking about lube and irritation. Mm-hmm. But in my presentation that I'll do at the summit, I go into like detail about the different kinds of mucous membranes that are on different body parts. So within the rectum, within the vagina and the penis. And so everybody is affected. Everybody who has mucus is affected. And specifically the rectum is the tissues there are very delicate. And so if you're using a lube anally, that's actually one of the most kind of like sensitive tissues that you could be putting a product on. Mm-hmm. And because a lot of lubes are more marketed and formulated for vaginal use, a lot of people using water-based lube anally just kind of live with like some discomfort and blame it on the idea that anal sex is painful, which A does not have to be true, and B, like there are lubes specifically designed for butts that are going to be so much better. They're so much better. Okay. I can understand that. So if you're wanting to understand more about osmolality, and is that something that you're going to get more into in your presentation, like the research and things like that at the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit?
Yes, definitely. I've got like visual aids are really helpful for the concept of osmolality. So I've got visual aids. And then also just going in a little bit deeper about like, how did we figure out what was happening with osmolality and what are the actual physiological things that are happening when you're using hyperosmotic lubricant on a body, on genitals. And hyperosmotic means that it has a much higher osmolality than the mucus of the body. And that's what you see the most commonly in commercially available lubricants. Is that it's hyperosmotic, that it's higher? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there other things that you're going to be covering at the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit? I know we're going to be talking some about this, but my understanding is that there's even more to it than just come and watch research. Yeah, no, it's definitely more practical and accessible than that. So talking about, what are the different kinds of lubes, how to either find the right lube for you or help somebody else find the right lube for them. And then why we start basically with just why do people use lube? Because that's actually very important, because there's a lot of reasons why people use lube other than like to make sex stuff slipperier. Uh-huh. There's a lot of kind of like therapeutic healing ways that people use lube that may or may not actually be sexual for them at all. And then we talk about the different types of lube. And then we get into kind of how to shop for, how to evaluate if a lube is safe, which includes osmolality, which includes pH, which includes just kind of knowing what the ingredients that you're looking at are and how to find that information, because it is not accessible to an average consumer. Like, you have to be really committed to find that. So I've been very committed, and I will share my knowledge. And then a little bit about lube regulation and how to navigate kind of like the marketing piece of that, because that can definitely throw people off of just like, people are lying to you on their labels. And here are some tips on to how to navigate that part of it. Mm-hmm. And then talking about really practical use and kind of special health circumstances. So what kinds of chronic health conditions might be benefited by using specific kinds of lubricants, and what kinds of chronic health conditions might make certain lubes more potentially harmful for that person versus somebody who's overall in good health, or, doesn't have a compromised immune system. Gotcha. And then there's just like a lot of context that kind of holds all of those pieces together of what we know from research, what kind of research has been done, and then what are the limitations. Like unfortunately, a lot of the presentation still comes back to like, there's a lot of things we don't know. Which is part of why I really encourage people to like be lube snobs, because you know your body best, you know your preferences best. So like try some stuff out and figure out what works for you, because we don't have enough information for there to be like an algorithm for us to like, guarantee you that our recommendation is going to be the best lube for you. So just not settling is like the best mentality to have when you want to find a lube.
Wonderful. I'm super excited to have you here at the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit. That's going to be on November 16th is when you'll be here. Is that right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So as we're kind of wrapping this stuff up, some people may be curious about what are some lubes that you do recommend. I don't know if you're sponsored by anybody or if you get paid for any of them. I don't. I just want people to have good lube. What are some of your recommendations?
I have no sponsorships. I have no sponsorships at all. I think that when I'm talking to folks who are doing, if they're in any sort of like an authority position where they're recommending lube to people, whether that's a sex educator or a therapist or a doctor, if somebody's just like, I would like a lube for sex to decrease friction, I'm always going to be like, silicone-based lube. That's the easiest one to recommend. It doesn't matter what brands. Gotcha. Just a silicone-based lube is going to be the safest recommendation. And some people worry about silicone-based lube because it feels like very new, or because it seems very like chemical to them. It is not a natural material like you would find out in the world. That is true. But it is the kind of lube that's on all pre-lubricated condoms and safer sex barriers. So most people have interacted with it at some point. They just don't realize that they have. It's very, very safe. So that's one thing that I would say. And then other kinds of lubes that I really like, there's a lubricant called Sutil, Sutil. There's two versions. One is a little bit thinner, one is a little bit thicker. That is one of my favorite lubes to recommend to folks, specifically anybody who's experiencing a decrease in estrogen levels. So, and was like born with a vagina, because when your estrogen decreases, it changes a lot of things about how your genitals work and your arousal function works. And I'm going to go into like nitty gritty details of that during the presentation, but just generally that is true for a lot of folks. So that's, trans folks, that's postmenopausal folks, that's folks going through cancer treatment or post-cancer treatment often. So it's a really diverse, wide group of people. But Sutil is really great because it's moisturizing and it has an ingredient called hyaluronic acid, which helps promote collagen production, which again decreases with that decrease in estrogen.
Wow.
So that's an example of a lubricant you can use as a lube, but is also an excellent daily moisturizer. So you could use it every day. You could use it a few times a week, but regularly using a product like that as a moisturizer can help those tissues heal and become a little bit more elastic again over time, which is excellent.
Wow.
And it's a company that I love. Like it's a mother-daughter owned company. They make a really great product. It's mostly organic. They have excellent ethics. Like I really love when I can recommend a product that I know is made really well by people who really care.
Nice. So
that's another reason I like to recommend Sutil. And then there's other water-based lubes that are super great. I'm a big fan of Aloe Cadabra. Again, really ethically made, really moisturizing. Okay. Water Slide is a very thin water-based lube that I really like as well, because it has the least ingredients of any water-based lube that I've ever seen.
Really?
So it's a good recommendation for folks who have a lot of sensitivities but don't know to what, but still want a water-based lube. And then when it comes to oil-based lube, I'm a big fan of a company called The Butters, and they make a couple different formulas of oil-based lube. They have a aloe and shea emulsion. They have a cocoa butter one that smells so good. And I like that product because excellent oil-based lube, but also affordable. Wow. really, really like ethically run company. And if you don't love using it as a lube, you can just use it as a moisturizer or use it for massage. And so it's a very multi-purpose product, which I think is awesome when you're on a budget. So yeah, there's tons of other excellent lubes out there, but those would be like my personal recommendations.
Wonderful. That's a place to start if you're curious about where you would like to start. There are many others, but I love that you're kind of giving us in those 3 categories some places we can start.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Dale. This has been very insightful, very enlightening, and I'm so excited to share this with everybody because I see the passion you have. It sparks the passion in me, and I want these parents, these individuals that are listening to be able to take this into their intimate lives and then also share this with your kids so that they start understanding it too. This is so important to know.
Oh, yeah. I think that the more we can talk about lube when we talk about sex education and safer sex is like the better, because I think that this is shifting. But this idea that like lube is only a thing you use when there's a problem is really pervasive. And that just bums me out, because everybody goes through phases of their life where lube is going to make their sex better or more comfortable, whether that's just like hormonal changes or aging or, you get one infection one time. But that's really important. But it also is going to make safer sex barriers more effective. So there's a really practical like safety element to lubricants where if you know, A, that there's more than one option out there, and B, that it's like going to make your sex safer, that's a really good motivator to get people to be more interested in using lube and not see lube as a bad thing. And yeah, also when it comes to like being a parent, oh my God, lube is really helpful. When folks are, if somebody has had a baby in their body and is also chest feeding or breastfeeding, then those same things that I talked about with decreased estrogen levels are happening. And a lot of folks don't get told about that. So they're like, oh, now that I'm, a mother or now that I'm a parent, I guess I just I'm not going to have the same kind of sexual response. And they sort of resign themselves. And I'm like, nah, just use lube regularly. This will pass. But also that's totally normal. And then also like parents just don't get a ton of sleep. They're stressed out a lot. And so that can slow arousal processes in anybody. That's just like a physiological thing. And lube, again, is a really, really great way to protect your tissues when those arousal processes are going slower, because your body just takes longer to warm up. And so you're more likely to have a little bit of irritation with friction. So yeah, lube's important for everybody.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah. I could talk to you about this all day. it's so fascinating to me, but we need to end the episode for today at least. And as time goes on, I'm sure we'll have you back on the episode or back on the show.
Awesome. I would love that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this podcast.
Thank you, Dale. We look forward to seeing you here in the next week.
Yeah. Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Birds and Bees podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions about the show, comments, or questions you would like addressed in another episode, please give us a call at 385-449-1818. Leave your voicemail and your question, or you can also email us at birdsandbeespodcast@gmail.com or visit us online at birdsandbeespodcast.com.